What happens when a nation stops making things? What happens when entire towns built around steel, lumber, textiles, cars go quiet? When fathers and mothers who spent decades on the factory floor suddenly find themselves without a job, a pension, or a plan B? What happens to the pride we once felt in seeing Made in America on a label? When now almost everything we touch is built someplace else besides the United States. I remember when Walmart used to advertise that everything in their stores was American made. You remember that? That was their whole identity. Big bold signs, proudly made in the USA. I mean, they leaned into it. They knew what mattered to people. And, to be honest, kind of made you feel good buying stuff that said made in the USA. Like you were supporting your neighbors and the people in your own community. But over time, those signs quietly disappeared. And the shelves, what they fill up with? Cheaper goods, right? Great. Shirts, toys, electronics, all imported from overseas. Most of it made in places with very low wages and virtually no worker protections. Not really much different than how Walmart treats its own employees. Walmart didn't invent offshoring, of course, but they did perfect it. They helped, right? They became so big, so powerful, they could dictate terms to their suppliers. Lower your cost or you're not going to get our business. So what'd that mean? It meant American factories had two choices: move operations abroad or shut down entirely. And all of this was framed, for efficiency's sake. They told us lower prices were good for consumers, right? They said that this is what it is. This is capitalism at its best. But what they didn't say was that those savings came at a steep cost. Lost jobs, gutted towns, and a slow erosion of our industrial backbone. So the real question is, did we lose manufacturing or was it taken away from us? And if it was, by who? Was it inevitable? Was it corporate greed? Was it bad policy? Or was it all the above? Because those factory jobs, they didn't just disappear into thin air, right? They were offshored to other countries. They were automated. They were deregulated, right? And the people left behind, they would say, hey, it's okay, you adapt. Pull up your bootstraps, right? And that's why the ultra-wealthy and the billionaires, they just went and bought more yachts and hoarded more wealth up top. And now with tariffs on the rise and a promise of reshoring back in the headlines, people are asking, can American manufacturing make a comeback? And if it does, what would the jobs look like? What's that going to look like in America now? Will it be people jobs or will it be machines taking those, right? This is more than economics. It's about identity. It's about the soul of the American worker. And today we're going to try to pull back the curtain on that. With that, I welcome you to Evergreen Perspective. I'm Ben Chrisley, and today we're going to ask what happened to American manufacturing and whether it's too late to bring it back. So let's rewind to a different America. But before we do that, let's bring in Kate for Kate's Civic Corner.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, folks. Kate here with the Civic Corner, taking a minute to highlight some opportunities to get involved here in Southwest Washington. If you don't live around here, get on the web and do a little searching. I'm sure you'll find some options around you. We'll put a link in the show notes for each of the events that we're featuring here today, where you can find more information, including what to expect and how to sign up. All right, coming up on May 10th at 10 a.m., we have the Lewis County Democrats General Meeting. This can be attended in person at the Twin Cities Senior Center in Chehalis or virtually. On May 11th, the Cowlitz County GOP is holding their action night in Kelso. And on May 13th, the Waukegan Board of County Commissioners are having their meeting at 9:30 a.m. at the County Courthouse in Kathlemet. Our volunteer opportunity for this week is with Grays Harbor National Wildlife Refuge. They're looking for folks to help with things like classroom lessons and field trips, shorebird surveys, invasive plant mapping, habitat restoration, boardwalk repairs, all kinds of great options. Take a look at the link for more information. These are just a few of the ways to get involved here in Southwest Washington. If there's a program or something in your area that interests you, seek that out. I'm sure there are volunteer options with those programs. If there's an event here in Southwest Washington that you'd like us to feature on Evergreen Perspective, please put it in the comments or send us an email. This is Kate with Kate's Civic Corner, encouraging you to get out there and get involved. Now back to Ben.
So, rewinding to a different time in America, let's picture Longview, Washington in the 1970s. The sun rising up over the Columbia River, workers lined up outside the Reynolds metal plant. There's a buzz in the air, shift change, truck engines, right? It's the sound of a place that produces something real. And for decades, that plant was the beating heart of that community. It didn't just make aluminum, it made paychecks, pensions, and possibilities. Let me introduce you to Tom. He grew up in Longview, not too far from the plant. His dad worked there before him. And when Tom graduated high school, he didn't need a college degree or a fancy resume. He had strong work ethic, strong back, and he was ready to get after it. He said, hey, I started at Reynolds in 1978, worked the pot lines and then maintenance. It was hard work. We had benefits, a union. I bought a house at 25. My wife stayed home. We weren't rich, but we never worried. See, back then, this kind of life wasn't rare. It was the rule. After World War II, American manufacturing was at its peak. And it wasn't just one region. It was everywhere, all across the United States. By the 1950s, nearly 1 in 3 Americans worked a job in manufacturing. These weren't some side gigs or temp jobs. These were careers, good jobs, and you didn't need a college degree to do it. You needed grit, a willingness to work hard, willingness to show up and get the job done. In Detroit, assembly lines rolled millions of cars out each year. Steel mills in Pittsburgh never stopped burning, right? The textile towns across the Midwest, sewing machines hummed all day, day and night, right? This industry was the lifeblood of the American economy. I grew up on a farm in Kentucky. My mom worked at a Jockey International sewing plant. At its peak in the 80s and early 90s, the plant employed over 300 people. It was easily the town's largest employer. And it wasn't just the job, it was the lifeblood of the town, right? Unions were strong. Unions helped negotiate real wages, solid benefits, and retirement packages that actually meant something. Health insurance was, part of the deal. In many cases, those jobs came with paid vacation, sick leave, and even tuition support for kids. In Tom's town, the union bulletin board wasn't just for organizing shifts. It's how people found out about weddings and softball games and baby showers. It was community, right? Factory wasn't just a workplace. It was a community center, right? It's a symbol of their town, right? And Tom said, look, we were proud. We were proud of what we made. You'd see aluminum from Longview used in planes, bridges, cars, and that meant something. For millions of Americans, this was the promise. If you worked hard, played by the rules, and showed up, America took care of you. This was the era that built the middle class, the kind of America where you could afford a home, raise a family, and still take your kids on a little vacation. Not because you struck it rich, but because the system was built to reward hard work. Jobs like Tom's weren't just jobs, they were foundations. You could support a family on one income. You could retire with dignity, right? Maybe most important, you felt proud about the work that you did. So what changed? How did places like Longview go from humming with industry to being told they needed to transition into something else? That's where the story shifts, right? It didn't just fall apart all at once, right? For them there, it was first a rumor, then a shift cut, then a temporary layoff, factory by factory, town by town. The system that had built America's middle class started to break down. In the 70s and early 80s, the country was hit hard with inflation, oil crisis, and global competition. Japan was making more fuel-efficient cars. Germany was making precision tools. And here at home, corporate America started to think less about the long term and more about now's bottom line. So for companies like Reynolds and Jockey International and thousands of others just like it, the new strategy became clear. Cut costs, shift production, maximize profits. Then came NAFTA, 1994, right? Went into effect, a North American Free Trade Agreement. Politicians promised it would create jobs and expand opportunities. But for small towns in places like Kentucky and Washington State, it meant something very different. It meant plants shutting down, right? Machines being packed up and shipped south of the border. Layoffs with no replacement, right? The NAFTA agreement passed in the 90s, sold to the public as a way to boost economies of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Politicians in the U.S. promised it would create jobs, raise wages, and lower prices. They said it would make American companies more competitive. But here's what really happened. Almost overnight, it became easier and far cheaper for companies to move production to Mexico, where wages were a fraction of what American workers earned, and labor protections there were minimal. Right? We were told it would free up the U.S. to focus on higher skilled jobs. But what we saw instead was a massive wave of offshoring. Factories in places like Kentucky and Longview and hundreds of other towns across the country started closing their doors. And it wasn't just factories that made clothing or electronics. It was parts manufacturers, tool shops, metal fabricators. Entire supply chains were vanishing, along with the jobs that supported them. Estimates vary, but it's believed that NAFTA led to a direct loss of over 700,000 U.S. jobs, and most of those were in manufacturing. And once those jobs were gone, they didn't come back. Right? And here's what made it worse. NAFTA didn't include any serious protections for American workers. There's no plan to help them transition, no guaranteed retraining, no guaranteed replacement income, no support to bring new industries into these communities, these high-skilled jobs. Right? They didn't show up. And yet corporate profits soared, right? Companies, they didn't just save money, they made more money than ever. Shareholders were happy, Wall Street was thrilled, and the message was always the same. This is the future. Adapt or get left behind. Then, to make things worse, 2001 came around. What happened in 2001? China joined the World Trade Organization. This was a huge tipping point, guys. Overnight, the global playing field changed. American companies suddenly had access to massive labor pools, millions of workers who were paid pennies compared to what American workers earned, with far fewer environmental or labor protections for those manufacturers to worry about. It was the opening of the floodgates, right? And the flood, it came fast. Corporations didn't hesitate. They didn't hesitate to move factories, right? Outsource supply chains and shift entire operations to China. Not because they had to, but because the savings were just too good to pass up. What followed was the single largest offshoring event in modern U.S. history. Within just one decade, the U.S. lost more than 3 million manufacturing jobs. 3 million. And those weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are real people, real livelihoods, retirements, communities, whole industries wiped out. Not because Americans couldn't compete, but because they never were given a chance. Textiles, gone. Furniture, shipped overseas. Electronics, virtually all of it. Even basic components for our own defense systems, like circuit boards, right? Semiconductors. Rare earth elements suddenly became dependent on foreign supply chain. And it didn't stop there. When manufacturing jobs disappeared, so did everything connected to them. Tool makers, maintenance crews, delivery drivers, local banks. The fallout wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Civics clubs shrank. Church attendance dropped. Crime went up. Addiction crept in. Right? See, it's domino effect. This wasn't just globalization, it was deindustrialization. It was the intentional dismantling of the American working class in exchange for cheaper goods and higher corporate profits. And here's the kicker. While all of this has happened, we're told it's progress. They said it was just the way the world is now. They told workers to learn new skills, adapt to the digital economy, and be grateful they could buy a new flat screen TV for under $300. But what good is cheap TV if you don't have a paycheck? That was the trade, right? Jobs for cheaper products. Dignity for discount retail. Manufacturing for market efficiency. And now, years later, we're still feeling the consequences, right? Tom remembers it all too well. He says we heard it coming. Management started talking, about global markets and energy costs. Then one day it was done. The Reynolds plant shut down. Just like that, a whole town left to try to figure out what the hell happened. And it wasn't just the plant. When the factory closed, so did the momentum, right? The diner down the road lost its lunch rush. The barbershop had empty chairs. Churches saw fewer envelopes in the offering plate. Right? Tax revenues dried up. Right? Schools lost funding. Even the local paper shrank down to nothing. People didn't just lose a paycheck, they lost identity, purpose, belonging. And in the background, CEOs were flying private. Wall Street cheered. Politicians called it free trade as if freedom had anything to do with it. So when people say, just go get another job, what they miss is that the next job usually paid less, had no benefits, no retirement, no respect. It wasn't just a career that vanished, it was a social contract, a construct of what the community was. Tom wasn't lazy, my mom wasn't unskilled. They got caught in a system that decided their lives were less valuable than a supply chain. Right? So who made these decisions? Who profited the most? Who looked the other way? Right? Let's be honest, the loss of American manufacturing wasn't some natural disaster. It wasn't some fluke of fate. It was a choice, a series of deliberate decisions made in boardrooms, the back rooms, and the floor of Congress. So who's responsible? Let's start with the obvious. Let's start with the ultra rich and the billionaires. Right? The CEOs, their job was to just make as much money for the shareholders and kick as much money up as they could. No trickle down. So how'd they do that? Right? They slashed jobs, they gutted pensions, and they offshored the factories. Not because any of these companies were struggling, but because the stock price wasn't growing fast enough for them. Make no mistake about it, these companies were growing just fine, just not fast enough in their opinion. They wanted more, and they wanted more at the expense of the hard-working American. These weren't survival moves for these countries. They were profit strategies. One factory closes, thousands of hardworking Americans lose their job, and the CEO gets a big bonus, right? Then we got Wall Street, right? The hedge funds and the private equity firms that saw small town factories not as some pillar of the community to be cherished, but as assets to be stripped down. They buy the company, load it up with debt, slash the workforce, cash out, and walk away. It didn't matter what you made. Aluminum, textiles, paper. Wasn't about anything but maximizing shareholder valuable. Right? They didn't care what happened at all. Congress is guilty as well on both sides. They helped pave the way. When they trade deal like NAFTA got passed and normalized trade with China, a lot of them passed it without even reading the entire bill. Right? And these politicians, they took the lobbyist money. They listened to corporate donors, right? And when the factories closed, they gave speeches about retraining. Then they would turn around and cut money for college. Republicans pushed hard for deregulation, union busting, and tax cuts that rewarded all this offshoring. But plenty of Democrats signed on too, swept up in the idea that a global economy would somehow lift everyone, right? Despite all the red flags on the ground. And then there were the lobbyists, thousands of them, crafting the policies that let this happen. Writing loopholes, right? Designing the tax breaks, making sure corporations could offshore, shelter profits overseas, and pay next to nothing in taxes while workers paid the price. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was a power shift from people who made things to people who just moved money. From the people on the factory floor who did the actual work to the top floor. Everything was designed to trickle up. It was not designed to trickle down. Right? The middle class didn't disappear. It was disassembled. It was dismantled. Right? It's been sold off one plant at a time to the highest bidder. And what do we get in return? Cheaper clothes? Maybe. Faster delivery of goods? Possibly. But at what cost? Broken towns, broken promises. An entire generation told to be grateful for a gig job with no health care. And as prices continue to increase, pay stayed the same. So no, it wasn't an accident. It was a business model, and it was supported by the government. And now we're being told that tariffs might bring it all back. Tariffs are back in the headlines. High ones, aimed squarely at China and other countries we've outsourced our production to for decades. And the message behind it is clear. We're going to bring American manufacturing back. Hey, that sounds good. But is it real? Let's talk about what tariffs actually do. At their core, tariffs are taxes on imports. The idea that by making foreign made goods more expensive, American-made products will become more competitive, right? And this theory, should incentivize companies to come back to the United States and build stuff. But here's the thing. Tariffs don't guarantee jobs, and they certainly don't guarantee good jobs. Some companies might shift production back to the U.S., but that doesn't mean they're bringing back thousands of union wage jobs with pensions and health benefits. In many cases, they're building high-tech factories that need more machines than people. We've seen it happen already. If a new semiconductor plant opens up, it opens up not with 5,000 workers, but with a few hundred engineers and technicians. And even those jobs require specialized training, right? And degrees, not the kind of work that a laid-off factory worker can walk into and learn. Right? There's something else tariffs do, right? They raise prices, not just on imported goods, but on anything that uses imported materials: steel, aluminum, electronics, machinery. That means higher costs for U.S. manufacturers, which can actually hurt the very companies supposed to be trying to help. And guess who usually ends up paying the price for all this difference? The U.S. consumer, right? Small business owners, builders, mechanics, teachers, families. And to be really clear here, a tax is a tariff. A tariff is a tax. But it's not a tax paid by China or Mexico or Vietnam. It's a tax paid by the American companies that import the goods from those countries. And then they pass them on to you at checkout, the American people. So if you see a tariff slapped on imported electronics or auto parts, you're not sticking it to a foreign government. You're just making the same product cost more for the person trying to fix their car, stock their shelves, or buy that laptop for school. Now, does that mean tariffs are useless? No, not necessarily. They can be a tool if they're part of a broader, long-term plan to rebuild domestic capacity. But on their own, tariffs are just band-aids to a much deeper wound, because the truth is you can't bring back manufacturing overnight. You can't. Let's say tomorrow that the government announced a full-scale reshoring effort. Even with high tariffs in place, it would take years and years, in some cases decades and decades, to fully rebuild capacity we lost. Think about what it takes. You have to find land, you have to get permits, you have to build facilities, order machinery, train workers, secure supply chains, source raw materials, and coordinate all that in a way that you can still remain competitive in the marketplace. Right? We're not just talking about plugging in a few machines and flipping the switch. We're talking about rebuilding entire ecosystems of production. Factories, logistic hubs, suppliers, skilled labor. And much of that no longer exists here in America in the volumes that we need it. And then there's the cost. It's always cheaper to make things in countries where workers are paid less and regulations are weaker. If companies do decide to move back to the U.S., they'll have to pay higher wages, obviously, right? Because that's fair. They have to meet stricter safety and environmental standards, because that's the right thing to do. And to recoup the massive cost of construction, relocation, and compliance, where do those costs go? Who pays for it? Right back to the prices you and I pay. Even if we bring factories home, the goods produced here will not be cheaper. They'll be more expensive, especially without real government investment. And many companies just simply won't do it. They'll just either raise prices, automate the jobs, or take the subsidies and outsource the work anyway. And let's not forget, we don't even have the raw materials we need here in the United States. Over the years, we've become so dependent on other countries for rare earth elements, metals, and components that go into everything from smartphones, solar panels, to fighter jets. It's not just a question of where we build things, it's whether we can source what we need to build them at all. So yes, tariffs might encourage a few companies to think twice about offshoring to start with. And yes, it might spark some domestic investment. But unless they're backed by serious industrial policy, infrastructure upgrades, workforce training, and supply chain development, tariffs alone won't fix the damage that took 40 years to create. Because the bigger issue isn't just where things are made, it's how they're made and who it benefits. You can bring a factory back to American soil, but if it's run by robots, owned by a private equity firm and offering $17 an hour with no benefits, did we really bring anything back? Or just the illusion of bringing something back? we want something real, if we want some real change, it's going to take more than tariffs. It's going to take a serious commitment to rebuilding an economy that values work, not just wealth, that rewards labor, not just capital, right? And that understands that the national strength isn't just measured by the GDP alone, but by the well-being of the people who actually make the country run. Because right now, the American workforce, and we're exhausted. We're disrespected, right? People are working 2 or 3 jobs just to stay afloat, fighting over schedules. They're skipping doctor's appointments. They're racking up credit card debt just to pay for groceries. And it's not because they're lazy. It's because nobody wants handouts, right? It's because jobs that pay real living wages are few and far between. And the ones that do exist out there are being automated, outsourced, or gatekept by 6 layers of qualifications. Meanwhile, the profits keep climbing, right? Corporate earnings hitting record highs, right? Their stocks are soaring. Billionaires are buying private islands and launching vanity rockets. Then they try to lecture the rest of us about grit and hard work, while their companies pay poverty wages that then the American government, our tax dollars, have to turn around and subsidize the American people for. We were told decades that wealth would trickle down, that if we just kept the top happy, cut their taxes, gave them bailouts, let them move factories overseas, they'd reinvest it all in us. They didn't. They hoarded it. They built a wall of wealth so high, you can't even see it from down here anymore, let alone reach it. And now we live in the consequence of those choices. We live in a country more divided than ever, not just politically, but economically. The wealth divide is the largest it's ever been in the history of the United States. You can feel it in the frustration, the rage, the sense that the system is broken, because it is. And this isn't an accident. That's what happens when you spend 40 years prioritizing corporate profits over community stability. When you export jobs, cut wages, and tell working people that their struggle is somehow their own fault, give me a break. This divide we see today between red and blue and urban and rural and young and old, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from policy. It came from greed, from decades of leaders on both sides failing to protect the people who actually built this country. So if we want to rebuild American manufacturing, fine. But we better be honest about what that means. It can't be just about restoring factories. It has to be about restoring dignity as well, right? About restoring fairness and pay, about paying real living wages, about making sure that people who work the hardest aren't the ones struggling the hardest just to survive. Because we don't need more billionaires. We need more balance, more security, more opportunity for Americans to make fair living wages. That's how we rebuild strength in this country. Not from the top down, but from the bottom up. So yeah, some manufacturing may come back, but the real question is, who will it come back for? Because for the people who've already lost everything, the factory workers, the mill hands, the families in towns built on industry, the comeback, it can't just be a headline. It has to be something real, something tangible, something personal. Let's take Canton, North Carolina, for example, right? For more than a century, this town revolved around its paper mill, right? Not that much different than Camas did at one point, right? This is just real recent. They had 1,000 people working there, right? It paid for homes, college tuition, retirement plans, right? Generations of families worked in this paper factory, right? The smell of pulp in the air was sharp, but the people in Canton smelled like security to them. Then in 2023, the company, Pactiv Evergreen, announced it was shutting the mill down. They gave workers 90-day notice. No plan to transition, no plan to stay, just a memo and a press release, and then silence. The mayor of Canton called it gutting. Gutting. That's exactly what it was. The mill wasn't just the job site. It was the economic and emotional center of that town. When it closed, the ripple effects were immediate. Right? Small businesses struggled and dried up. Real estate markets tanked. Families had to leave where they've spent their whole lives to go to try to find employment. Right? And the jobs, they just weren't there. New jobs didn't just appear out of nowhere. Right? They had to move elsewhere. You want to know what the collapse of American manufacturing looks like in real time? That's it. It looks like Canton. Looks like a town that gave everything to one company, loyalty, labor, time, and got abandonment in return. And this story for Canton, it's not rare, and it continues to play out right now. It's playing out all across this country, in timber towns, coal towns, port cities, textile hubs. Anywhere that once built America with their hands now struggles to keep the light on. So when we talk about bringing jobs back, we need to ask, back for who? Because if it's not for the people in places like Canton, if it's not for the folks who've been carrying this country on their backs, then we're not rebuilding anything. Right? We're just repeating the same cycle over again. So what would a real comeback actually look like? Right? Rebuilding American manufacturing isn't just about slapping tariffs on imports and cutting a ribbon in front of some new warehouse. Right? It's about building an economy that actually supports the people that do the work. Got to start treating people better. First, we need real investment, not tax breaks for billionaires, but federal and state funding for infrastructure, energy, transportation, right? Regional manufacturing hubs. We're talking about long-term projects that lay the groundwork for durable industry, not just short-term PR wins. We also need to rebuild the workforce pipeline. That means bringing back vocational training, trade schools, and apprenticeships. Right? It means valuing skills again. Electricians, machinists, welders, fabricators, not just white-collar degrees, right? That have mountains of debt. Right? Next, we need to attach strings to public money. If a company gets subsidized, it gets grants or tax incentives to open a factory in the U.S., there has to be real requirements. They have to pay living wages. They have to offer benefits. They can't just offshore it in the next 5 years after they've, met their obligation. Right? We need to use American suppliers whenever possible. No more blank checks for corporations that leave communities hanging. We need to rethink what kind of manufacturing jobs we're bringing back. Some will be automated. There's no avoiding that. But automation doesn't have to mean exploitation. If robots do more of the labor, then workers should share more of the profit. This means profit-sharing models, union representation, and ownership opportunities for employees, not just the C-suite. All right, let's talk about unions. We need to protect the right to organize again. Union jobs used to be the backbone of the middle class. They raised wages not just for their members, but for entire communities. And they've been under attack for decades. If we want stable, long-term manufacturing in this country, we're going to have to stop treating unions like the enemy and start recognizing them as the safeguard that they are for all hardworking Americans. And finally, we need to stop pretending the market will fix this on its own. The market isn't patriotic. The market doesn't care about people. The market will go wherever the labor is cheapest and the taxes are lowest. Unless we create rules that reward doing the right thing. We've already tried trickle down. We've already tried deregulation, privatizing, and the fantasy that if we just give enough to the top, it'll eventually lift everyone else up. It didn't. And it won't. A real comeback is going to require something that a lot of people just don't seem to have anymore, and that's courage to do the right thing, a commitment to the hardworking American people, right? And leadership that's willing to stand up to powerful interests and say, no, you're not going to sell out another town for a quarterly profit. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about going back to the past. It's about building something better. Stronger, fairer. Not just a return to made in America, but belonging in America. Right? So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? We've traced the rise and fall of American manufacturing, how it built the middle class, how it was dismantled for profit, and how millions of workers were left holding the bag. Right? We've talked about the trade deals, the outsourcing, the offshoring that got us here. We talked about the false promise of trickle-down economics. But more than anything, we've talked about people. Because behind every factory that closed was a family trying to get ahead. Behind every job shipped overseas was a community that paid the price. And behind every efficiency was a human being told that they were too expensive to matter. We didn't just lose manufacturing jobs in this country. We lost something much, much deeper. We lost trust. We've lost connection, community. We lost the belief that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded. Here's the thing, man, it doesn't have to be that way. We can rebuild, not just our factories, but our values. We can choose to prioritize workers over stockholders. We can invest in skills. We can invest in communities. We can invest in people, not just profits. And we can demand policies that reflect the simple truth that dignity shouldn't be negotiable. No one should have to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week and still wonder how they're going to keep the lights on. Not in the United States of America. And no one, no matter where you live, should be made to feel that their labor, their time, their life are disposable. This country was built by people who worked with their hands and believed in something bigger than themselves. It's time we built something again. And this time, let's make sure it works for all of us, not just the people up at the top. We gotta take care of the American people. And I'll leave it at that. I want to thank you all for listening here to Evergreen Perspective. Once again, I'm Ben Chrisley. I appreciate you guys spending time with me. I know these podcasts are long. If you've enjoyed it and you've listened to the whole podcast, leave me a message down below. Once again, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Until next time, see you soon. Bye-bye.